The bell above the door of Second Chances Thrift Store jingled with a forlorn, tinny sound, a feeble herald for the few souls braving the crisp autumn afternoon. Elara Jenkins stepped inside, the scent of aged paper, faint lavender polish, and the ghost of 1,000 lives washed over her. It was a smell she found comforting, a testament to persistence. At 58, her shoulders carried the weight of a recently concluded 30-year career in nursing, the last decade spent in the relentless ICU of County General. Her hands, now resting at her sides, had held the fragile line between life and death more times than she could count. Today, they sought something different, something to hold on to for herself. She ran a finger along the spine of a worn, leather-bound copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. It felt solid, real. Her son, Marcus, had bought her a sleek e-reader for her birthday, but it couldn't replicate this. The texture of history, the whisper of previous owners. "Find anything good?" Elara looked up. A young woman with vibrant pink hair and a nose ring smiled from behind the counter. Her name tag read Chloe. "Just browsing," Elara said, returning the smile. "I love your store." "Thanks. It's my grandma's. She's in the back sorting donations. Let me know if you need anything." Elara nodded and moved toward a rack of blouses. She was looking for nothing in particular and everything all at once. A new shape for her new life. Her eyes landed on a silk scarf, a beautiful cascade of peacock blues and greens. She reached out, the fabric cool and smooth against her work-roughened skin. On a whim, she draped it around her neck, the colors a startling vibrancy against her dark brown sweater. She caught her reflection in a dusty mirror, a splash of unexpected joy. She continued to browse, picking up a small chipped ceramic bird. A finch, she thought. It was cheap, just $1. She liked its resilience. She held the finch in one hand and absently kept the scarf draped around her neck, its softness a comfort. She meant to take it off before reaching the counter, but her mind was a million miles away, thinking of Marcus, of the empty, quiet house, of the vast, unscripted days that now stretched before her. It was this distraction that sealed her fate. She was examining a stack of vintage vinyl when a shadow fell over her. "Ma'am!" Elara turned. 2 police officers stood there, a man and a woman. The man was tall, with a jaw set in a permanent line of suspicion. The woman's eyes were hard, scanning Elara up and down, landing on the scarf. "I'm Officer Dugan. This is Officer Miller. We need you to come with us," the man said, his voice devoid of inflection. Elara's heart stuttered. "I'm sorry? What for?" Officer Miller pointed a slender finger. "The scarf. You didn't pay for it." A cold wave of understanding washed over Elara. Oh, my goodness. No, I was just trying it on. I forgot it was there. I was going to pay for it. And this." She held up the ceramic finch, her hand trembling slightly. "That's what they all say," Miller said flatly. "Please come quietly." The sheer absurdity of it stole her breath. "You can't be serious. I have my wallet right here. I'll pay for it now." "It's too late for that," Dugan said, his hand resting on his belt near his handcuffs. "Store policy. We were called for a suspected shoplifter, and we have confirmation." Elara's eyes darted to the counter. Chloe was gone. In her place stood an older woman with a pinched face, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to the officers. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at Elara's eyes. "They all say." The phrase echoed, laden with a prejudice she had spent a lifetime navigating, a lifetime of having to be twice as good, twice as professional, twice as calm. And now, in a thrift store, surrounded by the cast-offs of others, she was being reduced to a cliché. "Please," she said, her voice low, a heartfelt plea. "I am a retired nurse. I have no reason to steal a $5 scarf." "Empty your pockets and come with us," Miller repeated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The world seemed to slow down. Elara saw the other customers staring, their faces a blur of shock and morbid curiosity. She saw her own reflection again in the mirror, a capable, intelligent woman being treated like a common criminal. The vibrant peacock scarf now felt like a noose. With a dignity that cost her everything, she placed the ceramic finch carefully on a nearby shelf. Then she slowly reached up and unwound the scarf, the silk slithering from her neck like a dying dream. She held it out to Officer Miller. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, a sound she had only ever heard on television or in the distant trauma bays of the hospital. A part of Elara shattered. But deep beneath the shame and the shock, something else stirred. A slow, hot ember of defiance. They had chosen the wrong woman to make an example of. The ride to the station in the back of the squad car was a silent, surreal nightmare. Elara stared out the window, the familiar streets of her city warping into a foreign landscape of judgment. She focused on her breathing, a technique she'd taught countless anxious patients and their families. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. But the air in the car was thick with the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic, and it caught in her throat. At the station, the processing was a study in dehumanization. They took her purse, her wedding ring, a simple gold band she'd never taken off since the day Samuel, her late husband, had slipped it on her finger 25 years ago. They took her fingerprints, rolling each digit in ink, a violation that felt profoundly personal. Then came the mugshot. She was led to a plain white wall, a height chart etched into its side. A bored-looking desk sergeant sat behind a camera on a tripod. "Look here," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Elara lifted her chin. The flash was a brutal, unforgiving burst of light. It captured every line on her face, the tears she hadn't been able to hold back tracing a path through the foundation she'd applied that morning. It captured the shock in her wide, brown eyes, but also, if one looked closely, a glimmer of unyielding strength. This photograph, this moment of profound humiliation, would become her armor. She was placed in a holding cell, a cold concrete room with a hard bench. The metal door clanged shut with a finality that echoed in her soul. She was alone. She wrapped her arms around herself, the thin sweater offering no protection against the institutional chill. She thought of Samuel. What would he say? His quiet, steady anger would have been a force to behold. He'd always been her anchor, her shield against the world's cruelties. A fresh wave of grief, sharp and unexpected, joined the humiliation. This was not the retirement they had dreamed of. They were supposed to be traveling, visiting Marcus in Chicago, growing old and cranky together in their garden. Cancer had stolen him 4 years ago, and now, this. The cell door clanked open. A different officer, younger, with kinder eyes, gestured for her to come out. "Your one phone call," he said, his voice softer than the others. Her fingers trembled as she dialed. She pressed the phone to her ear, listening to the ring, a lifeline stretching across the city. "Hello? Marcus," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mom, what's wrong? You sound strange." The dam broke. The story tumbled out in a tearful, disjointed rush. The scarf, the accusation, the handcuffs, the mugshot. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a low, guttural sound of fury. "They did what?" "At Second Chances. Mom, I'm on my way. Don't say another word to anyone, not a word. I'm calling David Chen right now." David Chen, their family lawyer. A pit bull in a bespoke suit who had handled Samuel's estate. The mention of his name was a small raft in a churning sea. "I didn't steal anything, Marcus," she said, the need for her son to believe her overriding all else. "I know you didn't, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My God, I know. Just hang on, I'm coming." An hour later, after Marcus had posted bail, Elara walked out of the police station into the cool night air. The freedom felt fragile. Marcus stood by his car, his face a mask of controlled rage and worry. He enveloped her in a hug, and for a long moment, She just leaned into his strength, the familiar scent of his cologne a balm. In the car, he was silent for several blocks. Then he slammed his palm against the steering wheel. I'm going to sue them into the next century. The store, the police department, all of them. This is unbelievable. Elara stared out the window. The city lights blurred. They took my picture, Marcus. They put it in a file. He reached over and squeezed her hand. We'll get it expunged. This is a travesty. But Elara was no longer listening to him. She was replaying the moment in the store, the look on the officers' faces, the dismissive nod of the store owner. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a systemic assumption. Her lifetime of integrity meant nothing in the face of their bias. When they arrived home, the house felt different. It was no longer just a place of memories and peace. It had been violated by the day's events. She went straight to the bathroom and scrubbed her hands until they were raw, trying to remove the phantom feel of the ink and the cold steel. Later, as she lay in bed, sleep was a distant shore. The emotional whiplash of the day had left her raw. But in the quiet darkness, the ember that had been lit in the thrift store began to glow brighter. This was not just about a scarf. This was about her name, her dignity, the legacy she would leave for Marcus and for herself. She wasn't just going to fight this. She was going to change the game. David Chen arrived at Elara's house the next morning, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and a simmering intensity. He accepted a cup of green tea and settled at her dining room table, which was usually reserved for holiday dinners and jigsaw puzzles. Now it was a war room. Elara, Marcus, David began, his voice calm but precise. The good news is, this is a ridiculously weak case. The value of the item is negligible. You have no prior record, and your professional standing is impeccable. The district attorney will almost certainly drop the charges before it ever sees a courtroom. Almost certainly? Marcus challenged. It should be definitely. This is garbage. It is, David agreed. But the system is clogged and slow. They might offer a plea deal. Community service, and the record is sealed. It's the path of least resistance for them. Elara, who had been silent, staring at the steam rising from her own mug, looked up. A plea deal? She said, her voice quiet but firm. Admit to something I didn't do? It's not an admission of guilt, per se, David explained gently. It's a procedural tool to make it all go away with the least amount of hassle. Hassle for whom? Elara asked. For them? It's not a hassle for me to have my character assassined, to have a record, even a sealed one. She shook her head. No, I will not plead to anything. David leaned forward, a new respect in his eyes. Okay, then we fight. We can file a motion to dismiss. But, Elara, you need to understand, fighting means a court date. It means this hanging over you for months, possibly. It means the arrest record and the details becoming public. Are you prepared for that? Elara thought of the mugshot, that frozen moment of shame. She thought of the other black and brown faces she'd seen in the holding cell, processed with the same weary indifference. How many of them had been pressured into a path of least resistance for a crime they didn't commit? David, she said, her gaze steady. I spent 30 years fighting for lives. I can fight for my own. We go to court. A small smile touched David's lips. Good. He opened his briefcase. Then we need a strategy. The legal one is straightforward, but there's the other battle, the court of public opinion. He pulled out a printout. It was a local news blog with a small 2-paragraph blurb in the police blotter section. Elara Jenkins, 58, arrested for petty theft at Second Chances Thrift Store on Main. Marcus groaned. It's already out there. It is, David said. And if we do nothing, that's the narrative. But we can control this. He looked at Elara. Your story is powerful, Elara. Retired ICU nurse, widow, pillar of the community, falsely accused over a $5 scarf. It's a perfect storm of injustice. We can take this to the media, not the blotter, but the real media. We can put a face to this, and it's a face that demands compassion." Elara felt a flutter of anxiety. She was a private person. The idea of her name and picture being splashed across the news was terrifying. "What would that involve?" she asked quietly. "An interview, maybe with the Chicago Tribune. Telling your story. It would put pressure on the DA to drop the case immediately to avoid the bad press. It would also, well, it would inspire others. It would show that this can happen to anyone." Inspiring others. The phrase landed in the fertile soil of her resolve. Her personal shame could be transformed into a public lesson. Her private pain could become a source of strength for someone else. "Do it," she said. The interview was set for 3 days later. A reporter from the Tribune, a serious woman named Anya Sharma, came to Elara's home. She sat where David had sat, but with a notebook and a recorder instead of a briefcase. At first, Elara's answers were stiff, rehearsed, but as Anya asked her not just about the arrest, but about her life, about Samuel, about her career, about the profound disconnect between a lifetime of service and a moment of public disgrace, the floodgates opened. She spoke with raw, emotional honesty about the feeling of the handcuffs, the coldness of the cell, the profound loneliness of being presumed guilty. "What got you through it?" Anya asked, her pen still. Elara thought for a moment. "The knowledge of who I am, and the thought of all the people who don't have that same armor, the ones who can't call a lawyer, whose sons can't come get them. My resilience isn't just for me. It has to be for them too." The article was published the following Sunday. The headline was on the front page of the local section. "A healer's hands in handcuffs. Retired ICU nurse's arrest over scarf exposes deeper wounds." Beside the headline was the mugshot, but Anya had framed it not as a picture of a criminal, but as a portrait of injustice. The article detailed Elara's career, her family, the brutal absurdity of the arrest. It quoted Marcus, it quoted David Chen, and it even tracked down Chloe, the pink-haired clerk, who gave a tearful statement about how her grandmother had overreacted and she'd tried to stop it. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The story was picked up by national outlets. Offers for television interviews poured in. The comment sections, usually a cesspool of vitriol, were filled with messages of support. People shared their own stories of petty injustices, of racial profiling, of being presumed guilty. Elara's phone rang non-stop. Old colleagues, former patients, long-lost friends. Their support was a tidal wave of love and affirmation. The shame began to recede, replaced by a sense of purpose. The DA's office, however, remained silent. The legal wheels were still turning. A court date was set. The battle was not over. It was just beginning. And Elara Jenkins was ready. The media storm was a maelstrom Elara navigated with increasing grace. David Chen acted as her shield, filtering the requests, but he also encouraged her to use her voice. She did a single, carefully chosen television interview on a respected morning news show. Sitting under the bright lights, she was the picture of calm dignity. She spoke not with anger, but with a profound sadness that was more powerful than any shout. "This wasn't just about me," she said, her eyes looking directly into the camera, into the hearts of millions. "It was about a pattern. It was about the countless unseen, unheard people who are processed by a system that presumes their guilt. My privilege, my career, my support system is my megaphone. I have to speak for those who have been silenced." The response was a deluge. Letters and emails poured into David's office, forwarded to Elara. She began spending her afternoons at her dining room table, now covered in stacks of paper, reading them. They were heartbreaking, infuriating, and ultimately unifying. There was a letter from a Latino college student stopped for matching a description and held for 6 hours. An email from a black mother whose son was arrested for loitering outside his own apartment building. A tearful voicemail from an elderly white woman who had been falsely accused of stealing at a grocery store because she was confused and had put a small jar of olives in her pocket to free her hands. Each story was a thread, and together they were weaving a tapestry of a deeply flawed system. Elara felt the weight of their trust. This was no longer just her fight. She was carrying the hopes of a chorus of the unseen. Marcus, watching his mother transform from a private, grieving widow into a poised public figure, was awestruck. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," he said one evening, helping her sort the mail. "But are you okay? This is a lot." Elara looked up, her eyes tired but clear. "I've never been more tired or more sure of anything in my life, Marcus. In the ICU, we fought one battle at a time, one patient at a time. This is the same. It's just a bigger ICU." She decided to start a blog. She called it The Resilience Project. Her first post was simply a scan of her mugshot with the caption, "This is the face of a woman who spent 30 years saving lives. What does the face of injustice look like to you?" It went viral. Meanwhile, in the sterile corridors of power, the case against Elara Jenkins was becoming a hot potato. The DA, a political animal named Richard Thompson, was feeling the heat. His opponent in the upcoming election was hammering him on social justice issues. The editorial boards of major papers were calling for the charges to be dropped. His own staff was divided. He called David Chan. "David, let's talk about a disposition." "My client will not accept a plea," David said smoothly. "The only disposition we will accept is a full dismissal with prejudice and a public apology." "Be reasonable," Thompson sputtered. "The store made a complaint. The officers responded." "They responded with bias and you know it," David replied. "The body cam footage will show that. We go to trial, Richard, and we will subpoena every officer involved, the store owner, and we will put the entire policing model in this city on trial alongside my client." There was a long silence. "The court date stands," Thompson said finally, and hung up. David reported the conversation to Elara. "He's bluffing. He's hoping we'll crack." Elara simply nodded. She was past cracking. She was being forged. The night before the court date, she couldn't sleep. She went into the living room and picked up the small ceramic finch she'd bought that fateful day. She had gone back to Second Chances a week later, head held high, and purchased it. Chloe had been there and had tearfully apologized. The grandmother was nowhere to be seen. The backlash had been bad for business. Elara held the finch in her palm. It was small, chipped, but it had survived. It had found a home. She thought about the courtroom. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a stage, and she was ready for her close-up. The county courthouse was a monolithic structure of gray stone and imposing columns designed to intimidate. On the morning of her hearing, a crowd had gathered on the steps. They held signs that read, "Justice for Elara," and "A scrap of silk, a mountain of prejudice." News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Elara arrived with Marcus and David Chen. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue suit, a suit of armor for the modern warrior. A murmur rippled through the crowd as she emerged from the car. Someone began to clap, and then another, until the steps were filled with a rolling wave of applause. She stopped, overwhelmed. She looked at the faces, young, old, black, white, brown. They were here for her. The chorus of the unseen had come out of the shadows. A reporter shoved a microphone toward her. "Miss Jenkins, any last words before you face the judge?" Elara looked into the camera, her expression serene. "The truth needs no rehearsal," she said softly, and then turned and walked up the steps, Marcus and David flanking her like loyal sentinels. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of floor wax and old anxiety. The hallway was a river of humanity, lawyers in hurried conferences, families huddled on wooden benches, defendants with hollow eyes. It was the engine room of the justice system, churning and noisy. They pushed through the heavy double doors of courtroom 4B. It was already packed. Spectators filled the benches, and a line of people who couldn't get in stretched out into the hall. Elara saw Anya Sharma, the reporter, give her a small, encouraging nod. At the prosecutor's table, a young, nervous-looking ADA fumbled with his files. Richard Thompson, the DA himself, was conspicuously absent. "He's distancing himself," David thought with a smirk. The bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Reed." The door behind the bench opened and Judge Reed entered. She was a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She was known for being fair, but brutally efficient. She took her seat, her black robes settling around her. "Be seated," she said, her voice cutting through the room. She glanced at the docket. Case number 2023 CR 4581, The People versus Elara Jenkins. Counsel, are we ready to proceed? David Chen stood. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." The ADA stood. The people are ready, Your Honor." "Very well, call your first witness." The ADA cleared his throat. "The people call Officer Brenda Miller." Officer Miller, looking stiff and uncomfortable in her formal uniform, took the stand. The ADA led her through the basic facts: the call, the arrival, the observation of the scarf around Elara's neck. "And did the defendant attempt to pay for the item when you confronted her?" the ADA asked. "She mentioned it, but it was after we had identified ourselves," Miller said, her tone defensive. "It's a common tactic." David Chen stood for cross-examination. He approached the stand slowly, a predator assessing his prey. "Officer Miller, you stated that the defendant forgot the scarf was there. Is that correct?" "That's what she claimed." "But you didn't believe her." "Based on my training and experience, I found it unlikely." "Your training and experience," David repeated thoughtfully. "Did your training and experience also tell you that Elara Jenkins had no criminal record? That she was a registered nurse with an active license for over 3 decades? That she had been honored by the mayor for her service during the pandemic?" Miller shifted in her seat. That information wasn't available to me at the time." "So, your assessment was based solely on the fact that a black woman had an unpaid item in her possession in a store?" "Objection!" the ADA shouted. "Counsel's is implying bias." "Sustained," Judge Reed said, but her eyes were fixed on David. "I'll rephrase," David said smoothly. "What was available to you at the time, officer?" "You saw a 58-year-old woman calmly browsing with a scarf around her neck and a small ceramic bird in her hand. Is that an accurate description?" "Yes." "And based on that snapshot, you decided she was a shoplifter?" The store owner confirmed it. David turned and picked up a remote. A screen descended from the ceiling. "Let's see what the body cam footage confirms, shall we?" The courtroom held its breath. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy, color-drained view from Officer Miller's body cam. There was Elara, her face confused, then alarmed. They heard her voice, polite, clear. "I was just trying it on. I forgot it was there. I was going to pay for it, and this." She held up the Finch. They saw the dismissive expression on Miller's face, heard her say, "That's what they all say." The video stopped. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. David didn't say another word. He simply looked at the jury, then at the judge, and returned to his seat. The damage was done. The phrase hung in the air, toxic and undeniable. That's what they all say. The heroic facade of the arrest had crumbled, revealing the deep-seated prejudice at its core. Elara, sitting at the defense table, felt a tear roll down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of vindication. They had all seen it. They had all heard it. The truth was no longer just her word against theirs. It was there, in pixels and sound, for the whole world to see. The prosecution's case unraveled with breathtaking speed. Officer Dugan was a sullen, uncooperative witness who could only reiterate that they had probable cause. The owner of Second Chances, a Mrs. Gable, was a disaster on the stand. Under David Chen's relentless cross-examination, she admitted that she had a problem with shoplifting but had no specific security protocol, and that she had assumed Elara was guilty because she looked shifty. "Shifty?" David repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. Can you describe what Shifty looks like, Mrs. Gable? She stammered, unable to form a coherent answer. The jury, a diverse group of 8 women and 4 men, watched her with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disgust. The ADA, seeing his case circling the drain, rested. "The defense calls Elara Jenkins," David announced. A ripple of anticipation went through the courtroom. Elara stood, smoothed her suit, and walked with a quiet grace to the witness stand. She swore the oath, her voice clear and steady. She met the gaze of the jurors not with defiance, but with an open honesty. David began with the soft questions, letting her paint a picture of her life. She spoke of growing up in this very city, of meeting Samuel in college, of the joy of raising Marcus, of the profound calling she felt to nursing. "Can you describe the day of your arrest, Elara?" David asked, his voice gentle. She took a deep breath. She described the simple pleasure of a quiet afternoon, the beauty of the scarf, the comfort of the store. Then, she described the moment the officers approached. "It was like the floor disappeared," she said, her voice trembling with remembered emotion. "One moment I was a person, a customer, a human being. The next, I was a shoplifter. The handcuffs, they were so cold. It was the coldest I have ever felt." She looked directly at the jury. "And I have held the hands of the dying." The profound silence in the room was broken by a few muffled sobs from the gallery. "Why didn't you just pay for the scarf when they confronted you?" David asked. "Because I was in shock," she explained. "And because I knew in that moment that it wasn't about the scarf anymore. It was about them not believing me. It was about them seeing me not as Elara Jenkins, but as a black woman who fit a profile. Paying for it then would have felt like bribing my way out of their prejudice. I couldn't do it. My dignity was all I had left." It was an incredible, heartfelt moment. She had articulated the unspoken calculation that so many people of color are forced to make. The ADA stood for cross-examination, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He tried to trip her up on minor details, but Elara's memory was precise, her demeanor unshakable. "Isn't it true, Ms. Jenkins, that you've leveraged this arrest for fame? That you have a blog? You've given television interviews?" Elara looked at him, her eyes filled not with anger but with a deep, abiding compassion. "I have used my voice, yes, not for fame, but for the countless people who have written to me, who have shared their own stories of being unseen, unheard, and presumed guilty. My story became a megaphone for their silence. That is not leverage, that is a responsibility." The ADA had no more questions. As Elara stepped down from the stand, Judge Reed did something highly unusual. She looked at Elara and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of respect from one professional woman to another. The defense rested. The case was all but over. The ADA's closing argument was a weak, perfunctory recitation of the law of probable cause. He seemed to be just going through the motions, eager to be done. David Chen's closing was a masterpiece. He didn't talk about the law, he talked about people. He held up the ceramic finch, which had been entered as an exhibit. "This," he said, walking before the jury, "is what Elara Jenkins intended to buy. A small, chipped, imperfect bird. It cost $1. She liked it because it was resilient." He placed it back on the table. "The prosecution would have you believe that this woman, this healer, this hero of our community, risked everything for a $5 scarf. They ask you to believe that her 30 years of integrity vanished in a single moment of greed in a thrift store." He paused, letting the absurdity of it sink in. But this case was never about a scarf. It was about a look. It was about an assumption. It was about a phrase. "That's what they all say." That phrase is the key to this entire case. It reveals a heart of bias, a mindset that sees not individuals but stereotypes. Elara Jenkins wasn't arrested for shoplifting. She was arrested for being black while holding a scarf. He turned and pointed at Elara. "You have the power today. You have the power to look at Elara Jenkins and see her for who she truly is. You have the power to reject the stereotype. You have the power to affirm that her life, her work, and her dignity matter. Do not let this courageous woman be defined by a lie. Find her not guilty. Send a message that in this courtroom we see people, not profiles." He sat down. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Judge Reed began her instructions to the jury. The legal language was dry, but the stakes were palpable. The jury filed out to begin their deliberations. The waiting began. Elara, Marcus, and David moved to a small, windowless consultation room. Minutes ticked by, then an hour. The tension was a physical presence in the room. Back in the courtroom, the spectators and media waited. The story was being live-blogged, tweeted, dissected. After 2 hours, a buzzer sounded. The bailiff stood. "The jury has reached a verdict." A frantic scramble ensued as people rushed back to their seats. The air was electric. Elara walked back into the courtroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, held the verdict form. "Madam Forewoman," the clerk said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the count of petty theft, how do you find the defendant?" The forewoman looked directly at Elara. "We find the defendant not guilty." A collective gasp, followed by an explosion of cheers and applause, rocked the courtroom. Marcus hugged his mother, tears streaming down his face. David Chen let out a triumphant breath. The gallery erupted. But Elara did not cheer. She closed her eyes, a single heartfelt tear of relief tracing the path of the one shed in her mugshot. It was over. She was free. Judge Reed banged her gavel, but the celebration continued. She let it go on for a moment, a rare allowance, before calling for order. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Reed said, her voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted. "The court finds you not guilty. You're free to go. But before we adjourn, I feel compelled to say something." She removed her glasses, her expression grave. "This case has exposed a festering wound in our community. The court is not blind to it. Therefore, I am using my authority to enact an immediate, court-wide procedural lockdown." A confused murmur ran through the room. "A lockdown? Effective immediately," Judge Reed's voice rang with authority. "And until further notice, no individual in this county is to be arrested, charged, or detained for petty theft where the value of the goods is under $20, unless there is clear, unequivocal evidence of intent to deprive, such as witnessed concealment or fleeing the premises. A simple mistake, a moment of distraction, will no longer be criminalized. This scarf test, as I'm calling it, will be the new standard." The courtroom was utterly silent, stunned. "We will not waste precious resources, shatter innocent lives, and erode public trust over a $5 scarf," the judge continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "We will focus on real crime, and we will, starting today, begin a mandatory implicit bias training for all law enforcement in this jurisdiction, to be developed in consultation with experts, including," she looked at Elara, "community stakeholders like Ms. Jenkins." The shock gave way to a deeper, more profound understanding. Elara had not just won her freedom. She had changed the system. She had locked down the court with a new, more compassionate protocol. It was an incredible, heroic victory. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind. Elara was swarmed by well-wishers and reporters outside the courthouse. She held Marcus's hand tightly, a beacon of grace and hard-won peace. That evening at home, the quiet felt different. It was no longer the quiet of loneliness, but of profound accomplishment. She was exhausted, soul deep, but it was a clean exhaustion. A few days later, a formal, typed letter arrived from the office of the district attorney. It was a full, unequivocal apology for the grave error in judgment and the distress caused to an upstanding member of the community. Richard Thompson had signed it himself, but the real victory was in the ripples. News of Judge Reed's lockdown order spread across the country. Other municipalities began discussing similar reforms. Elara's Resilience Project blog became a non-profit organization dedicated to legal aid for those falsely accused and to promoting police reform. One afternoon, she received a phone call from Judge Reed's office. The judge was forming a community oversight committee to design the implicit bias training and wanted Elara to chair it. Elara accepted. Months passed. The notoriety faded, but the purpose remained. Elara found a new rhythm to her life, one that was somehow fuller than her retirement had ever dreamed of being. She was no longer just a retired nurse, she was a catalyst for change. One crisp autumn day, almost a year to the day after her arrest, she was walking through the park. The leaves were turning the same fiery hues as the peacock scarf. She saw a young mother struggling with a stroller and a toddler who was having a meltdown. The mother looked harried, on the verge of tears herself. Elara walked over. "Can I help?" The mother looked up, grateful. "Oh, thank you. He just dropped his favorite toy." Elara bent down and picked up a small, grubby teddy bear. She handed it to the toddler, who immediately stopped crying. As she stood, the mother looked at her more closely, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. You're her, aren't you? Elara Jenkins." Elara smiled softly. "I am." The young woman's eyes welled up. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I was one of the unseen. Your story gave me the courage to fight my own battle. You have no idea." They stood there for a moment, two strangers connected by a shared understanding of resilience. Elara felt a profound sense of closure. This was the lesson. That our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength, and that one person's courageous stand can create a tidal wave of compassion, changing countless lives in its wake. She continued her walk, the sun warm on her face. She was free, not just from the charges, but from the past. She had walked through the fire of injustice and had emerged not with ashes, but with a purpose forged in steel. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that her second act was just beginning.